Hi, my name is Mohammad Tahaei, and today I'm going to talk to you about our paper, Stuck in the Permissions with You, Developer and End-User Perspectives on App Permissions and Their Privacy Ramifications. This is a work I did in collaboration with Ruba Abu-Salma from King's College London and Awais Rashid from the University of Bristol. The motivation behind this work comes from the rich literature in permissions about their privacy ramifications, their security ramifications, and their usability issues. Since the early 2010s, there have been hundreds of papers, if not more, talking about the permissions and their security and privacy and usability issues. However, there have been very few studies of developers who work with those permissions, studied understanding of permissions, and how they select certain permissions. In this study, we want to fill this gap and understand why developers select certain permissions, what they think about permissions, and what are their privacy considerations regarding permissions, and whether they face any challenges when they work with permissions. We framed 3 research questions. In the first research question, we wanted to understand how developers decide on what permissions to request. In the second research question, we wanted to understand what is developers' understanding of permissions and permissions privacy ramifications. And the third research question, we wanted to compare developers' views of permissions with users' views of permissions. We employed a mixed method approach to answer our research questions. In the first part of this research, we used a qualitative method, interviews with 19 developers, and the second part of the research, we developed a survey rooted in the developer findings to understand users' attitudes towards permissions. For this part, we recruited 309 Android and iOS users. What did we find? We found that developers often ask for location, camera, photo gallery, internet, and data storage permissions. And very much like developers, users said that they mostly see location, camera, and photo gallery permissions. They also often see microphone and contacts permissions. So it seems like there is a bit of misalignment between how developers think about what kind of permissions they ask for and what users see in apps. Next, we wanted to understand how developers and users think about permissions and what do they think permissions do. Developers mostly see permissions as an access control mechanism, which enables them to get access to certain resources and users' data. Sometimes they also see it as a consent mechanism that helps them use users' data. Users similarly mostly see permissions as an access control mechanism, and they also see it as a functionality providing mechanism. A mindset that didn't come up with developers was about making apps compliant with the laws. We think that sometimes perhaps permission dialogues are confused with consent dialogues, making users think that permissions are there to make apps compliant with the laws. Interestingly, some users also saw permissions as a mechanism to collect their data, not necessarily to protect their data. We also compared our findings to prior work that used knowledge and comprehension questions to ask about users' understanding of permissions. In our case, most of the time, users thought that they understand what kind of permissions are being asked, what they do. So they think that very much they are aware of what's going on with permissions in their smartphones. However, the prior work's knowledge-based survey shows that users are often confused and they cannot fully understand the scope of several permission requests. Therefore, we find a gap between users' understanding and perceptions of permissions and their knowledge, which requires further attention by the research community and operating systems designers. Similarly, we find that developers also sometimes include multiple permissions because they want to avoid any crashes as a result of scope confusions. We asked developers about privacy ramifications of permissions and which permissions they find mostly sensitive. They consider calendar and anything related to location and running in the background as sensitive. On the other hand, users often see location as very sensitive and photos and storage as the second most sensitive permissions. Overall, our study uncovered many issues with permissions. Some of them were known, but some of them were unknown, specifically issues around developer challenges and a comparison of those issues with developers' understandings. We find that permissions sometimes are included because developers are confused about permission scopes and they do not know which permissions should be included. Therefore, they included multiple permissions. So there's a question of whether permissions are actually grounded in the app's functionality. We argue that permission descriptions and names need a fresh look because we find that some developers had to include an extra page on top of the operating system permission descriptions to explain exactly why they wanted to include the permission in their app, which resulted in extra work for developers and also for users because they have to read extra information. The names of those permissions with multiple scopes, for example, the location permission, can also be confusing for both users and developers. There's also a question of who is responsible for granting permissions and what happens to the data collected after that. Because on the developer side, they completely see users as the responsible party for granting permission, and users also accept this responsibility, which puts a lot of pressure and burden on users. We also think that despite the massive number of research on permissions and their usability issues for users, there's still a gap between users' beliefs and knowledge about permissions. And we still need more research to find out how permissions can be made more usable for both users and developers, considering their privacy and security ramifications. Thank you very much for listening.